Good morning, class. So today is day 2 of our novel study. What I want to make sure we first talk about is I want you to think about what you read yesterday with Percy Jackson. A lot happened in that chapter, and it was a little bit confusing. So I want us to remember what happened. So we were introduced to Percy. Some of the character traits that we used to describe in the beginning of the book were that he was a little bit rash and reckless. We can also see from later in the book that he's a smart character. He knew a lot about Greek mythology, but he's also a little bit timid, and he doesn't necessarily believe in himself and his capabilities. So later in the story, in that first chapter, we also ran into an altercation with Mrs. Dodds, and then after that mythical fight, no one believed that it happened, and everyone was like, who's Mrs. Dodds? We don't know him. And Percy was like, well, that's weird. So we're going to get more into that this week with why that was, and a little bit more content and context behind all of what happened yesterday in chapter 1. Today we're going to be working on something different. So our objective is Kipsters will be able to use context clues to determine the meaning of a word. Context clues are hints that the author gives to help you solve unknown words. So the reason why we're going to talk about context clues now is because there might be some vocabulary in this book that you don't know. So I want to make sure that we have a little bit of practice with context clues this week, so that while you're reading it, if you come across an unknown word, you can use those context clues in the moment to solve for it so that you can make sure that you're understanding the story. So when we get to our first example, we're going to go through the steps. Right now, you can open up to chapter 2. So you can open the document that is in day 132, chapter 2, and listen to me read while you follow along. Chapter 2. 3 old ladies knit the socks of death. I am so sorry. I was used to the occasional weird experience, but usually they were over quickly. This 24/7 hallucination was more than I could handle. For the rest of the school year, the entire campus seemed to be playing some kind of trick on me. The students acted as if they were completely and totally convinced that Mrs. Kerr, a perky blonde woman whom I'd never seen in my life until she got on our bus at the end of the field trip, had been our pre-algebra teacher since Christmas. Every so often, I would spring a Mrs. Dodds reference on somebody, just to see if I could trip them up, but they would stare at me like I was a psycho. I got so I almost believed them. Mrs. Dodds had never existed. Almost, but Grover couldn't fool me. When I mentioned the name Mrs. Dodds to him, he would hesitate, then claim she didn't exist, but I knew he was lying. Something was going on. Something had happened at the museum. I didn't have much time to think about it during the days, but at night, visions of Mrs. Dodds with talons and leathery wings would wake me up in a cold sweat. The freak weather continued, which didn't help my mood. One night, a thunderstorm blew out the windows in my dorm room. A few hours later, the biggest tornado ever spotted in the Hudson Valley touched down only 50 miles from Yancey Academy. One of the current events we studied in social studies class was the unusual number of small planes that had gone down in sudden squalls in the Atlantic that year. I started feeling cranky and irritable, most of the time. My grades slipped from D's to F's. I got into more fights with Nancy Bobofit and her friends. I was sent out into the hallway in almost every class. Finally, when our English teacher, Mr. Nicol, asked me for the millionth time why I was too lazy to study for spelling tests, I snapped. I called him an old sot. I wasn't even sure what that meant, but it sounded good. The headmaster sent my mom a letter the following week making it official. I would not be invited back next year to Yancey Academy. Fine, I told myself. Just fine. I was homesick. I wanted to be with my mom in our little apartment on the Upper East Side, even if I had to go to public school and put up with the obnoxious stepfather and his stupid poker parties. And yet there were things I'd miss at Yancey. The view of the woods out of my dorm room, the Hudson River in the distance, the smell of pine trees. I'd miss Grover, who'd been a good friend, even if he was a little strange. I worried how he'd survive next year without me. I'd miss Latin class too, Mr. Berner's crazy tournament days and his faith that I could do well. As exam week got closer, Latin was the only test I studied for. I had forgotten what Mr. Bruner had told me about this subject being life and death for me. I wasn't sure why, but I started to believe him. We're going to pause for a second. I want you to go to the line. It's about halfway through the page, or halfway through what we've read so far. And it starts with, I started feeling cranky and irritable most of the time. I want us to think about that word irritable. You may have heard it before, but maybe you don't know what it means. So we're going to practice thinking about that word using our context clues. So the first thing that you would do, and you can look at this if you're looking at day 132 questions, the steps are right here. Highlight the word or phrase you don't understand. So you can see on my page, just like you guys have it. Oh, I'm sorry. This is not going to work. But you can see on my page, if you're following along, where I put model, it says, what does the word irritable most likely mean? And then I put this sentence there. I said, page 17, I feel cranky and irritable most of the time. So I highlighted the word irritable. It says, underline key phrases and ideas in the sentence. So I put the feeling of cranky, I underlined that because they're using those two words kind of as synonyms there. Feeling cranky and irritable. Number 3, give the main idea of the passage. So that part of the story, he's talking about how basically like at school, no one is talking about Mrs. Dodds. His grades are dropping. The weather is bad. And he's like waking up with nightmares and all that kind of thing. So I can tell that in this paragraph, or in this part of the story, that Percy Jackson is not feeling himself. He's not feeling good. He doesn't feel normal like himself. He's not happy. So that's what I would put for like what the main idea is about this word. Then I'm going to use this sentence in my own words. So I started feeling upset most of the time. So I know that makes sense. If I said he was feeling cranky and he's upset most of the time, that sounds right and that makes sense. And then 5, I'm going to guess what the word means. So my guess is the word irritable most likely means annoyed or moody because it's talking about how he's cranky. Cranky would mean something like annoyed or moody. And it also talks about all these negative things that are happening because of his feelings. So when you get to do some on your own, that's what you're going to do. You're going to follow those 5 steps and decide what you think the meaning of the word most likely is. All right, so we're going to go back to our story and continue reading. So you can go back to where it says the evening before. We'll stop and do another one in a little bit. The evening before my final, I got so frustrated. I threw the Cambridge Guide to Greek Mythology across my dorm room. Words had started swimming off the page, circling my head, and the letters doing 180s, as if they were riding skateboards. There was no way I was going to remember the difference between Chiron and Charon, or Polydictes and Polydeuces. And conjugating those Latin verbs, forget it. I paced the room, feeling like ants were crawling around the inside of my shirt. I remembered Mr. Bruner's serious expression, his 1,000-year-old eyes. I will accept only the best from you, Percy Jackson. I took a deep breath. I picked up the mythology book. I'd never asked my teacher for help before. Maybe if I talked to Mr. Bruner, he could give me some pointers. At least I could apologize for the big fat F I was about to score on his exam. I didn't want to leave Yancey Academy with him, thinking I hadn't tried. I walked downstairs to the faculty offices. Most of them were dark and empty, but Mr. Bruner's door was ajar. Light from his window stretching across the hallway floor. I was 3 steps from the door handle, and I heard voices inside the office. Mr. Bruner asked a question. A voice that was definitely Grover's said, "Worried about Percy, sir?" I froze. I'm not usually an eavesdropper, But I dare you to try not listening if you hear your best friend talking about you to an adult. I inched closer. Alone this summer, Grover was saying. I mean, a kindly one in the school? Now that we know for sure, and they know too? We would only make matters worse by rushing him, Mr. Brunner said. We need the boy to mature more. But he may not have time. The summer solstice deadline will have to be resolved without him, Grover. Let him enjoy his ignorance while he still can. Sir, he saw her. His imagination, Mr. Brunner insisted. The mist over the students and staff will be enough to convince him of that. Sir, I can't fail in my duties again. Grover's voice was choked with emotion. You know what that would mean. You haven't failed, Grover, Mr. Brunner said kindly. I should have seen her for what she was. Now, let's just worry about keeping Percy alive until next fall. So I want us to think through one more example. So the word in here was eavesdropper. He says, I'm not usually an eavesdropper, but I dare you try not listening if you hear your best friend talking about you to an adult. So what I would underline there is, I dare you to try not listening. So when he was eavesdropping, he was listening in on a conversation. So I know that eavesdropping, it means like you're kind of being nosy, right? It means you're listening in on a conversation that you're not a part of. Because the whole part of that paragraph, or that whole part of that page, was talking about how he was listening into a conversation that he wasn't a part of. So I would have highlighted that word eavesdropper. I would have underlined that part where I said, I dare you not to try listening if you hear your best friend talking about you to an adult. The main idea is that Percy is listening to a conversation, or the gist that I would write for this section. Percy is listening to a conversation about him that he's not a part of. And then if I said the sentence in my own words, I would say, I'm usually not that nosy, but I dare you not to try listening if you hear your best friend talking about you to an adult. And so my guess is the word means nosy. All right. That is one more example that you can see in the model. So now you're going to be ready to do the next ones on your own. I'm going to continue reading on to the next page. The mythology book dropped out of my hand and hit the floor with a thud. Mr. Brunner was silent, my heart hammering. I picked up the book and backed down the hall. A shadow slid across the lighted glass of Mr. Brunner's office door. The shadow of something much taller than my wheelchair-bound teacher, holding something that looked suspiciously like an archer's bow. I opened the nearest door and slipped inside. A few seconds later, I heard a slow clomp, clop, clop, like muffled wood blocks. Then a sound like an animal snuffling right outside my door. A large, dark shape paused in front of the glass, then moved on. A bead of sweat trickled down my neck. Somewhere in the hallway, Mr. Brunner spoke. Nothing, he murmured. My nerves haven't been right since winter solstice. Mine neither, Grover said. But I could have sworn. Go back to the dorm, Mr. Brunner told him. You've got a long day of exams tomorrow. Don't remind me. The lights went out in Mr. Brunner's office. I waited in the dark for what seemed like forever. Finally, I slipped out into the hallway and made my way back up to the dorm. Grover was lying on his bed, studying his Latin exam notes, like he'd been there all night. Hey, he said, bleary-eyed, you going to be ready for this test? I didn't answer. You look awful, he frowned. Is everything okay? Just tired. I turned so he couldn't read my expression and started getting ready for bed. I didn't understand what I had heard downstairs. I wanted to believe I'd imagined the whole thing. But one thing was clear. Grover and Mr. Brunner were talking about me behind my back. They thought I was in some kind of danger. The next afternoon, as I was leaving the 3-hour Latin exam, my eyes swimming with all the Greek and Roman names I'd misspelled, Mr. Brunner called me back inside. For a moment I was worried he'd found out about my eavesdropping the night before, but that didn't seem to be the problem. Percy, he said, don't be discouraged about leaving Yancey. It's for the best. His tone was kind, but the words still embarrassed me. Even though he was speaking quietly, the other kids finishing the test could hear. Nancy Bobofit smirked at me and made a sarcastic little kissing motions with her lips. I mumbled, "Okay, sir." "I mean," Mr. Burner wheeled his chair back and forth like he wasn't sure what to say, "this isn't the right place for you." It was only a matter of time. My eyes stung. Here was my favorite teacher in front of the class telling me I couldn't handle it. After saying he believed in me all year, now he was telling me I was destined to get kicked out? "Right," I said, trembling. "No, no," Mr. Burner said. "Oh, confound it all. What I'm trying to say, you're not normal, Percy. There's nothing to be—" "Thanks," I blurted. "Thanks a lot, sir, for reminding me. Percy—" But I was already gone. On the last day of the term, I shoved my clothes into my suitcase. The other guys were joking around, talking about their vacation plans. One of them was going on a hiking trip to Switzerland. Another cruising the Caribbean for a month. They were juvenile delinquents like me, but they were rich juvenile delinquents. Their daddies were executives or ambassadors or celebrities. I was a nobody from a family of nobodies. They asked me what I'd been doing this summer, and I told them I was going back to the city. What I didn't tell them was that I'd have a summer job walking dogs or selling magazine subscriptions and spend my free time worrying about where I'd go to school in the fall. "Oh," one of the guys said, "that's cool." They went back to their conversation as if I'd never existed. The only person I dreaded saying goodbye to was Grover. But as it turned out, I didn't have to. He'd booked a ticket to Manhattan on the same Greyhound as I had. So there we were, together again, heading into the city. During the whole bus ride, Grover kept glancing nervously down the aisle, watching the other passengers. It occurred to me that he always acted nervous and fidgety when we left Yancey, as if he expected something bad to happen. Before, I'd always assumed he was worried about getting teased, but there was nobody to tease him on the Greyhound. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I said, "Looking for kindly ones?" Grover nearly jumped out of his seat. What do you mean?" I confessed about eavesdropping on him and Mr. Bruner the night before the exam. Grover's eyes twitched. "How much did you hear?" "Oh, not much. What's the summer solstice deadline?" He winced. "Look, Percy, I was just worried for you. I mean, hallucinating about demon math teachers." "Grover. And I was telling Mr. Bruner that maybe you were overstressed or something, because there was no such person as Mrs. Dodds and—" "Grover, you're a really, really bad liar." His ears turned pink. From his shirt pocket, he fished out a grubby business card. "Just take this, okay? In case you need me this summer." This card was in fancy script, which was murder on my dyslexic eyes, but I finally made out something like Grover Underwood, keeper, Half-Blood Hill, Long Island, New York, 800-009-0009. "What's half—" "Don't say it out loud," he yelped. "That's my, summer address." My heart sank. Grover had a summer home? I never considered that his family might be as rich as the others at Yancey. "Okay," I said glumly. "So, if I want to come visit your mansion?" He nodded. Or if you need me." "Why would I need you?" It came out harsher than I meant it to. Grover blushed right down to his Adam's apple. "Look, Percy, the truth is, I kind of have to protect you." I stared at him. All year long, I'd gotten in fights, keeping bullies away from him. I'd lost sleep worrying that he'd get beaten up next year without me. And here he was acting like he was the one who defended me. "Grover," I said, "what exactly are you protecting me from?" There was a huge grinding noise under our feet. Black smoke poured from the dashboard, and the whole bus filled with a smell like rotten eggs. The driver cursed and limped the Greyhound over to the side of the highway. After a few minutes clanking around the engine compartment, the driver announced that we'll have to all get off. Grover and I filed outside with everyone else. We were on a stretch of country road. No place you'd notice if you didn't break down there. On our side of the highway was nothing but maple trees and litter from passing cars. On the other side, across 4 lanes of asphalt shimmering with afternoon heat, was an old-fashioned fruit stand. The stuff on sale looked really good. Heaping boxes of blood-red cherries and apples, walnuts and apricots, jugs of cider, and a clawfoot tub full of ice. There were no customers, just 3 old ladies sitting in a rocking chair in the shade of a maple tree, knitting the biggest pair of socks I'd ever seen. I mean, those socks were the size of sweaters, but they were clearly socks. The lady on the right knitted one of them, and the lady on the left knitted the other. The lady in the middle held the enormous basket of electric blue yarn. All 3 women looked ancient, with pale faces, wrinkled like fruit leather, silver hair tied back in white bandanas, bony arms sticking out of bleached cotton dresses. The weirdest thing was, they seemed to be looking right at me. I looked over at Grover to say something about this and saw the blood had drained from his face. His nose was twitching. "Grover," I said. "Hey, man." "Tell me they're not looking at you." "They are, aren't they?" "Yeah, weird, huh? You think those socks would fit me?" "Not funny, Percy. Not funny at all." The old lady in the middle took out a huge pair of scissors, gold and silver, long-bladed like shears. I heard Grover catch his breath. "We're getting on the bus," he told me. "Come on." "What?" I said. "It's 1,000 degrees in there." "Come on." He pried open the door and climbed inside, but I stayed back. Across the road, the old ladies were still watching me. The middle one cut yarn, and I swear I could hear the snip across 4 lanes of traffic. Her 2 friends balled up the electric blue socks, leaving me wondering who they could possibly be for, Sasquatch or Godzilla. At the rear of the bus, the driver wrenched a big chunk of smoking metal out of the engine compartment. The bus shuddered, and the engine roared back to life. The passengers cheered. "Darn right," yelled the driver. He slapped the bus with his hat. Everybody back on board. Once we got going, I started feeling feverish, as if I'd caught the flu. Grover didn't look much better. He was shivering and his teeth were chattering. "Grover." "Yeah?" "What are you not telling me?" He dabbed his forehead with his shirt sleeve. "Percy, what did you see back at the fruit stand?" "You mean the old ladies?" "What is it about them, man? They're not like Mrs. Dodds, are they?" His expression was hard to read, but I got the feeling that the fruit stand ladies were something much, much worse than Mrs. Dodds. He said, "Just tell me what you saw." "The middle one took out her scissors and she cut the yarn." He closed his eyes and made a gesture with his fingers that might have been crossing himself, but it wasn't. "It was something else, something almost older," he said. "You saw her snip the cord." "Yeah, so?" But even as I said it, I knew it was a big deal. "This is not happening," Grover mumbled. He started chewing his thumb. "I don't want this to be like the last time." "What last time?" "Always, 6th grade. They never get past 6th grade." "Grover," I said, because he was really starting to scare me. "What are you talking about?" "Let me walk you home from the bus station. Promise me." This seemed like a strange request to me, but I promised that he could. "Is this like a superstition or something?" I asked. No answer. "Grover, that snipping of the yarn, does that mean somebody's going to die?" He looked at me mournfully, like he was already picking the kind of flowers I'd like best on my coffin. Chapter 2 is done. So now, not only has he encountered Mrs. Dodds, but he's also encountered these three wise women. So you're probably thinking, like, why are they after Percy? Like, what's happening? And is Percy going to be okay? And that's what we're going to find out later this week. For today, you're going to be answering your questions about context clues. Remember to go through all 5 steps. Highlight the word or phrase that you don't understand or that you're being asked about in the question. Underline the key phrases and ideas in that sentence. Go back to the story and think about what was the gist or the main idea of that paragraph or that page. Say the sentence in your own words and then guess what the new word means. So you're going to have practice for this. On page 16, you're going to be doing the word hallucination. On page 28, you're going to be doing the word mournful. And on page 26, you're going to be doing the word pride. So I will have all 3 of those in the document for you, and you can go through all 5 steps for your context clue practice. Tomorrow we will be reading chapter 3, and I'm so excited to see what new adventures we learn about for Percy Jackson. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.